Well, good afternoon. My name is Victor Garcia Yzaguirre. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Girona, and I will be participating in this set of sessions on behalf of the Department of Philosophy of Law of the University of Alicante, to whom I am very thankful for this opportunity. Well, my purpose in these sessions will be to explain in a couple of videos two things. First, in this video, I will present a short introduction to the study of defeasibility according to legal jurists. That is, what are legal theories thinking about when they talk about defeasibility. And in a second video, I will present the main techniques used by judges in order to defeat a norm, that is, to create an implicit exception. Well, I go straight forward to the point. What kind of legal practice are we trying to clarify when we talk about defeasibility? To be clear, I will present a fictional case, but not a very strange one, as you will see. Well, during COVID-19 pandemic, a large number of countries implemented a series of measures that restricted the freedom of movement. That is, they implemented mandatory quarantines. These quarantines implied that we had the obligation to stay home, and those who went out home without a permission, they were fined, plus they were coerced to return home. Well, let us imagine a country with a quarantine regime with a heavy fine. And in this kind of context, we have to evaluate the physical and emotional implications of this regime. These were particularly severe in a certain group of people, a certain subgroup of people that lives with autism spectrum disorder, with ASD. For these people, their quarantine regime caused an enormous increase of severe anxiety attacks. Well, having this in mind, let us imagine a case of a father with a minor with ASD that decided to take his son out of the house and have a short walk down the street so that he will feel better and wouldn't have a new anxiety attack that day. Well, once they were walking calmly, a police or a military officer stops them and fines them, plus coercing them to return home. Well, let us suppose that the fine was appealed, was questioned to the local judge, and the judge ruled the following: that even though the antecedent of the norm was verified in this case, the normative consequence should not be imposed, since the departure from home was due to health needs, which operates as implicit exceptions. Okay, these kind of scenarios, legal theories will say the judge defeated the norm. We can identify an infinite number of additional cases. This is a regular practice in judicial application of law. To make a generalization, a shortcut to these kind of cases, we can say that this kind of practice show us cases in which the judge creates implicit exceptions in order to avoid that he wouldn't apply a norm that causes unjust, inefficient, or absurd consequences. In order to present these kind of practices, and in order to explain, to theorize what this implies for the legal system, legal theories have introduced a new concept that allow us to discuss about these things, the notion of defeasibility. Well, to present the idea in short words, legal theories tend to preach that the defeasible nature of legal norms uh, refers to the impossibility for us to identify the complete list of exceptions to a norm. This suppose that we cannot know ex ante if a norm is applicable or not to an individual case. Well, this is the main framework. This is the big idea. What I will try to do now in the minutes that I have left is to make an introduction to what have legal theories, have said about this characteristic of the norms. What these tell us about the legal system and about the legal norms. Well, First of all, when legal theories talk about the feasibility, they are being ambiguous. They are not they are not expressing the same ideas. They are using the same label to refer to different concepts. Well, first, the second point is that not all legal theories are talking in the same language, or we are not talking about the same kind of problem. We can identify theorizations about implicit deceptions made from the theory of interpretation, or how judges identify norms. Some other legal theories have done it from the theory of the structure of norms, that is, what an implicit deception means when we are trying to reconstruct the antecedent of norms. And a third group of legal theories are trying to explain or trying to theorize these kind of situations from the theory of legal conflicts. That is, they are trying to present what means that a norm conflicts with another one, and what we are doing when we resolve it. We resolve them. So, for the following minutes, I will present these three types of discussions, and finally, I will summarize with some ideas that allow us to understand these three types of discourses better. Well, first, the feasibility from the interpretation theory. A group legal theories have proposed that the creation of an implicit deception is better understood as an interpretative process. In this, in this sense, for example, a very famous legal theorist, Frederick Schauer, has proposed a set of theses in order to reconstruct and even justify the creation of exception as an act of identification correctly of a class that presents the best generalization of the purpose of the class, standard or not, to be more clear. In extreme synthesis, this author proposed that the selection of properties contained in the antecedent of the norm is the result of an specification of the purpose of the norm, of its justification. Every time we take a literal interpretation of a provision of a normative standard, let us suppose that indicates a possible case. So we have two results. The scope of the norm according to this interpretative method, according to the literal interpretation, and of course, the scope according to the purpose or the justification of why this type of regulation was introduced in the legal system. This won't be problematic, this won't be an issue if both scopes are the same. But we have a problem when these two scopes that are not coextensive, when they regulate different cases. Schauer, who rescues some labels from the beginning of the 20th century, called these situations recalcitrant experiences. We have an over-inclusive recalcitrant experience in those cases where the specifications contained in the antecedent, according to the literal interpretation, are undesirable, are not required, since its effects, its consequence generates some repercussions that cannot be justified by the purpose of the norm. So, in order to remedy, to solve this type of situation, it will be necessary to introduce a new specification in the antecedent. To say it more clearly, this allows to regulate certain substance or actions differently from in the antecedent. Let me rephrase. If we take into account the purpose of a norm, then it will be justified that a certain subgroup that is regulated according to the literal meaning of the interpretation of a certain statement should have another type of regulation, should not be regulated in this way. Of course, a scenario of over-inclusive recalcitrant experience only invite us to ask ourselves how we should resolve this discrepancy between the expected solution from the literal interpretation and the expected solution from the purpose of the norm. One possible option, of course, is to assume, to use the suboptimal result. So, this shows us that the problem of recalcitrant experience, of course, is a problem of interpretation, but secondly, it's a problem of the attitude in which a judge will address to these kind of situations. We can show, in extreme synthesis, two models. A formalist model, in which a judge will consider relevant only the literal meaning, and of course, an adaptability model, a judge that considers that is relevant to take into account the purpose of the norm. If I use the model of adaptability, then I will create exceptions, then um, I will reinterpret the disposition in order to include this new exception. Well, this, of course, is not the only type of discourse. This is not the only type of theorization available in legal theory. A second group of legal theories has proposed the understanding of the notion of divisibility as a theoretical concept that allows us to clarify the structure of a type of conditional norm. One of the best legal theorists that have explained this point is Carlos Alchurron. Well, when the studies of the deontic logic started, when we started to incorporate this framework in our ways of understanding the law, we had certain situations that could not be explained by um, the habitual way, the regular way of understanding a normative conditional. We had some defeasible conditionals, that is, antecedents that are not sufficient to justify justify the use of the bonus ponens for the consequent. What we have is that in certain cases, in certain circumstances, just to be cautious when in the discourse, when we express an antecedent, we are doing a complex statement. We usually, for language economy, we express certain properties, but we are left unexpressed certain other properties. They are implicit properties in the sense of they they are not expressed in a normative statement, not because they don't exist, we are trying to deny them. It's because we don't need them in order to show our idea. To make a simple example, if I say if a person kills another one, then it's mandatory to condemn them to 10 years in jail. The action to kill another person is not sufficient to be condemned to 10 years. I only present this idea like this for language economy. There are other several implicit assumptions that can be identified in the rest of the legal system. That is, that there were no exception, there were not legitimate defense, that there were not circumstances that that free me from responsibility that are also regulated in the penal code. So when we talk about implicit deceptions in this kind of discourses, in these kind of theorizations, we are talking about those implicit properties that has not been expressed, that has not been said in the legal discourse, that when they are explicited, then we can show us that the norm does not regulate the case. Thirdly, another group of legal theories has proposed to understand the notion of divisibility as a theoretical concept that allow us to clarify the process and resolution, of a normative conflict. One of the best theorizations of this idea has been formulated by Andrea Dolcetti and Giovanni Battista Ratti. So, these authors explain us that we can have express norms. That is, norms that can be identified from the normative statements that has been created by the legislator, by parliament. And we can identify implicit norms in the sense that they are creations of the of judges, that is, judicial creation of the law, that they incorporate a new norm in the legal system. So, there are certain cases, there are certain situations in which an express norm conflicts with an implicit norm, the norm that the judge has created by himself. In these cases, after this conflict, if the judge decides to prefer the implicit norm, that will be a case of implicit exception. So, I will take my 5 last minutes to rephrase and to present this point. So, are all legal theories talking about the same thing? Are we expressing the same point? I think not. So, when we are talking about the feasibility, as I said in the beginning, we are talking about processes of creating implicit exceptions. But how do we create an implicit exception? What are these three types of discourses telling us about this process? I think they are telling us that we can create an exception in two ways. The first way, by reinterpretation. That is, judges, when they are faced with a normative statement, they have to attribute, they have to fix it with some meaning. And when the literal meaning is not enough, does not satisfy our axiological requirements, we are not, um, we don't believe that this is just efficient, this is not absurd, some other evaluative, um, an evaluative judgment, the judge decides to use another an interpretation method and attributes this normative statement a different meaning. A way of creating an exception is by reducing the scope of the antecedent by introducing new properties in the antecedent. This can be made by changing the interpretative method. Which methods? We will see it on the second video. This is one way. What is the consequence of this? That the original norm, the one that I took into account, the prima facie norm, let's say more precisely, becomes irrelevant for the case. It has no normative consequence to regulate the situation. This is one option. The second option is to uh, create justify violation of the norm. This is a different operation. In this case, we are not going to change the meaning of a normative statement, a normative statement. What we are going to do is that in cases when it has a normative conflict, we are going to have to introduce a new norm. I will be more precise here. In the case of Andrea Dolcetti and Giovanni Battista Ratti, we have an express norm versus an implicit norm. And in order to solve this, I will have to create a third norm, a preference criteria, which will determine which one is the applicable norm for this case. What does this imply? That the preferred norm is the one that is going to be used as a normative premise, and the norm that is not used, the norm that is not preferred, is the norm that we are going to call defeated. Of course, what is the difference besides the theoretical reconstruction are the practical consequences. If I use the first type of the creation of exceptions, the first way of understanding the feasibilities as reinterpretation will be, that is, the approach from legal interpretation theory and a structure of norm theory, the defeated norm is irrelevant. But from the second approach of the feasibility to create an exception is to create a preference relations between norm. The defeated norm is not irrelevant. It is relevant. And it can imply that the case, depending on the legal system, we will have to use some compensatory duties that it generates some moral repercussions and, of course, legal repercussions. This is the case of, for example, of the legal torts in cases of justified violations. So, in the next video, we will see the legal methods in order to achieve the first type of exception or the second type of exception.